In the office today of Brian Cunningham, the Assemblymember from Brooklyn, the Democrat. Thanks so much for sitting down with us today.
Thank you so much for coming.
So let's start with the news of the day. It's Tin Cup Day.
Yeah.
Of course, Zohran Mamdani appearing for the first time as mayor in this environment, in this venue. What did you think of the interactions he had with both those on your conference and the other side too?
Well, obviously, it's Zohran's second time back in the building, right? I think he came for the state to state, and now he's back for Tin Cup Day, which is a totally different dynamic. I think state to state was an opportunity for him to celebrate being back.
Yeah.
Now it's to answer tough questions. I think what we saw today was a mayor who now has the responsibility and weight of an entire city. An agenda he's put forward about affordability, and now looking at some of his colleagues who he worked in the past, some he got along with and some he didn't get along with, and saying to them what the needs of the city are. We know that there's a $12 billion potential gap in funding, and I think the mayor is he's done a phenomenal job, I think, in answering some of the questions, both from his colleagues and from folks across the aisle from him. And I think he's made the case for why New York City needs the investment from the state. I think he's been dead right in terms of affordability, in terms of the childcare piece. I think there's still some conversation around what we're going to do in terms of free and fast buses. I think we've gotten buses fast. Have they been free? I think there's some questions there. And I think in terms of the questions of taxability and who we tax to help pay for these things, and whether or not we have enough revenue in our coffers to actually afford these programs this year and look at next year as a new opportunity to have conversations. So I think he's done a good balance in that.
There were some questions. He had his presentation about the budget a couple weeks ago now, and even today he said, "Well, now we're projecting, what was it, $7 billion? I think it was something like that. It was less than original." I think there's some people that are like, "Well, in the campaign, that some of his experience was questioned." Yeah. Do you see any of that? Some of this a learning curve, even today, out of him right now that you think would need to be addressed here in the next few months and years?
Yeah, look, when I got here in 2022, I came here with a lot of experience working in both the private sector, state government, and federal government. But there's a different weight when you sit behind a desk and look at the realities of our yellow book, which is our budget book. And I think there's a different weight for the mayor at this time looking at the city's budget and information he would not have as a campaign or as a candidate running for office. I think obviously since 2020 with the global pandemic, we've seen a huge shift both in state and municipal funding. We had a lot of money from the federal government because of COVID funding. A lot of that money is expiring. A lot of things that were aspirational are now things that we have to take a look at, particularly with the federal government that's ever changing. We've woken up morning after morning for the last year with changes to our federal government, whether it be the Trump tariffs or whether it be funding being pulled, and also the pandemic plus our crisis with our migrants who are seeking refuge in our city and our state, right? So I think we're trying to figure out how to recalibrate, and that is a good step for any leader. I think he's figuring out how to pivot and how to look at the reality in front of him and not things that were behind him. I think being a state lawmaker is one thing, being a mayor of a major city, but I think this is the second most important job in the country. Again, I think he's going to learn pretty quickly. He's a quick study, and I'm wishing for the best for our mayor.
How realistic is his ask? As he hasn't backed down. We even heard that right after the state of the state. Yeah. He said, I'm still maintaining what I campaigned on. Yeah. As someone, like you said, that sees the books, knows what the state has to offer when it comes financially. How realistic is it? Obviously, that was part of the back and forth today of asking how feasible is it, and will it make New York more expensive for people?
Look, I think the mayor has a job to advocate for the 5 boroughs and the 5 counties that he represents. I think state lawmakers look at this from a bigger picture. We have 62 counties to think about, whether it's Buffalo or Brooklyn or Syracuse or everywhere between. We have to think about as a state, what number are we comfortable in terms of a $260 billion budget in terms of resources? And I think my colleagues and I will have those conversations through these hearings. It's just one of many hearings that are happening. And we're going to put forward our one house agenda shortly, both with the Senate and the Assembly. And we're going to work with the governor hand in hand to try to figure out how to deliver on a budget that makes New York affordable for everyone, not just in the 5 boroughs, but certainly as a member from the 5 boroughs. We'll certainly be leading and fighting for the resources that we think we are owed as a city.
So if you, as a chamber, align with what he wants to do, how do you make that palatable for the governor at the end of the day, which that's where there's been the disconnect?
There's always a dance between the governor and the legislative body. Obviously, we've seen this in the last 3 or 4 budgets. Yeah, there's been some back and forth on how we get there. I think one thing that we agree on as a supermajority in both houses and the governor is that affordable, and I think, quite frankly, my colleagues on the other side agree that there is an affordability crisis. how we get there is different in terms of how we think the approach is. I think over the course of the next couple of weeks, I think in March we'll start to hunker down a little bit more. But I think we'll even get to the goalpost of how do we make this year's books add up? How do we relieve the stress, economic stress for many New Yorkers across the state of New York? And certainly New York City is a big part of what people think about when they think about New York City. And I think we want to make sure that we take care of New York. I think one of the things the governor's come out the gate and said is we want to deliver free childcare. And I think that's a huge first step. I think people are realizing $8.5 billion investment over the last 2 years to try to realize and actualize this goal. And I think there are other parts of this elephant we're going to continue to bite to make sure New York is affordable.
Universal childcare obviously is one of the big ones this year. It has been. I know that's something that the legislature has pushed for in the last few years as well. In terms of the dynamic and how that works, I think that's what your colleagues on the other side of the aisle have questioned. Do we have the workforce? Do we have the infrastructure to be able to do this? Is that built in?
Yeah.
And where does that fit in your conversation?
So I think the governor's done a great job of outlining how we do this, right? And I think one of the things she said from her announcement in Brooklyn was, one, let's build out 3K across the state. We've had 3K since Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio helped usher in the era to New York in 2014, 2015. And I think now she's saying, let's go a little deeper and start a pilot program for 2K, specifically in the city of New York, where we know we have, a 10 million people population, as well as a bigger bucket of resources, I think over $100 billion budget there. Let's start there with a pilot program. Let's figure out how to fix the infrastructure issues upstate. And let's continue to work on the workforce issue. Governor Kathy Hochul is not new to this in many ways. Remember when she was lieutenant governor, she focused on the child task force. And I think a lot of these ideas aren't new ideas. These are just ideas we're building on, and we've made the proper investments year over year. Last year, this year, and next year, we'll continue to make the investments to make sure that childcare is a reality. This is something small businesses want in terms of their workforce returning. This is what parents want. I'm a father of a 2-year-old. I know how difficult it is to balance the schedule, pickup time and drop-off time, and making sure we have what's the second highest bill for many New Yorkers is paying for childcare after their rent or mortgage. So we know the importance of this in terms of keeping New York as a place where families can continue to stay, grow, and develop.
Do you think it'll cost more knowing that there are some of those other issues when it comes to workforce and infrastructure, like that, than some of those projected numbers of 7-8 billion?
Look, I always think that you pilot something, you test things, and this is why we have annual budgets, that we don't just pass 4 or 10-year budgets where we say this is the number, we're not going above or below. Every year we look at these policies, we look at what we're doing, and we try to measure against it, which is why you see the dance with the budget. You see sometimes there's a number thrown out there, then they say, well, we didn't spend all the money last year, and we go, we're projecting to spend it this year. The budget dance is not just a disagreement. It's how do we actually make right the holes, and how do we scale up to the current moment.
So how do you sell that upstate? I've spoken with some upstate Democrats that say that there'd be a no if the universal child care, pre-K, whatever it's going to be, is just in this budget, just going to start in the city.
Yeah.
So how do you get everybody on board to something that initially won't help everyone?
Well, I think that's wrong, and that's why conference is important, right? Because when we talk about the 3K program, that is something that we've had in the city for a number of years. Upstate has been part of that program, and they haven't fully developed that program. So we want to figure out how to help scale up those programs, whether it be the workforce, whether it be resources. So I think the governor's taking a targeted approach here of saying that, just like upstate always says, we're different from New York City. New York City is different from upstate New York as well. And sometimes we start things in New York City that scale up upstate, and we start things upstate that scale downstate. These are different economies at different sizes, different scales, and I think we could actually meet the moment and actually close a gap on 3K upstate and around the state. And downstate, we can pilot a program that puts on a course to universal child care.
When you speak of funding, obviously you look outside, and the governor has said that the revenues can help pay for that. And then you look at funding other initiatives, and that comes with that, the push from Zohran Mamdani to tax the rich and tax the most wealthy. Where do you think that fits into this conversation right now? Especially considering the governor also digging her feet in the sand on that.
Look, I think in this particular argument around taxing the rich, I think the governor has made it clear that we have enough revenue, and she's projected a $260 billion budget, which is larger than last year's budget, suggesting that we have enough resources to cover all the existing programs, including universal child care. I think if we have a starting place where we say we have enough resources to cover this year, I'm going to side here with the governor on this one. While I obviously love our mayor and have worked with him on a number of issues as a former colleague and as our mayor, I think if we have enough resources, let's kind of stay where we are in the moment of using those additional resources, seeing where they land, and then looking at next year's budget and seeing if there's gaps in our budget. I think certainly you and I, who probably balance our checkbooks for our families, for ourselves, would kind of say, let's spend what we have right now and let's not try to figure out. You don't project for potentials. You project, you base your budget based on what actuals. And I think we have to look at the actuals right now in this moment.
That's a good real life application. Like that, everyone can get that.
So that I get it.
So, all right. So you said you side with the governor on this one. Obviously, made some waves last week when it comes to siding with the governor. In contrast to your own county and your own, your own block, if you want to say that, down in Brooklyn. Why?
Look, I think people have known for the last year or so, the governor and I have had a lot of conversations. I would think it was widely publicly that I was on our shortlist for lieutenant governor. And I said at those times that whether I was the governor's selection or not the governor's selection, then I would support this governor, because I think over the last 4 years, got to remember when Kathy Hochul came to this position, we were just coming out of COVID. We were deep in a very dark place in our state. You look at what she's done in the last 4 years, I think it's consistent. It's been decisive. I think she's been a steady hand at the wheel. And I don't believe that now was a time for a change in the guards. And I think, obviously, with that said, for me, it wasn't about switching my affiliation or my endorsement, because if I said I support you today and tomorrow I will, if the governor gave me a reason because of a policy difference, that's something you negotiate and you talk through. You don't just use a endorsement as something that you pull from somebody because we have one or two disagreements.
But the Democrats in Brooklyn did that initially.
Well, let's be clear. I think it was our district leaders who had a different position. And some of that landed on, I think, what people don't understand is that some of it was some folks in Brooklyn, district leaders specifically, supported a different candidate in the race, right? Some had supported the governor's race. And I think there was a split between how many absentees, how many people were for and were against. I think ultimately, when you look at the elected officials in Brooklyn, there are many elected officials in the state assembly and the state senate who are elected who do support this governor. And I think there are district leaders who also support the governor. And I think, obviously that is a county issue. That is not an individual issue. I support Brooklyn Democrats. I support my county leader. I support the folks who are leading the fight, both on the ground level and here in Capitol and City Hall. But I also support this governor. I think, one of the things that we call for, even when I was at the Dems convention last year, was for a moment of unity at this moment. I think, and obviously with the primaries behind us at this point, I think there's no one running against the governor in the primaries, that our marching orders moving forward is how do we move forward as a Democratic Party united in the mission to make sure that we defeat Trump tariffs, that we make sure we drive down the cost of living for New Yorkers and make New York an affordable state.
Yeah, you spoke about unity on Friday as well. Yeah. That was a big part of what you spoke on. Just one more on that is just, were the individuals, like you said, the leadership, were they upset that you weren't the pick for lieutenant governor? Where did you fit in that? Because obviously you were on the short list, but then you're supporting, there's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, there were a number of people from Brooklyn, and there was no shortage of talent throughout the state. When you look at all the people's names who appeared, I was just honored to be in that conversation with many of the people who I respect, District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, Secretary of State Walker Bosley, even some of the folks in Queens. I think we had a tremendous list of tremendous people who would have been a great asset to the governor, but the governor found somebody who she can work with, someone who's going to be a partner to the governor, someone who has municipal experience, someone who's going to make a historic ticket here in the state of New York. Obviously, we're right outside of Syracuse, where the women's suffrage movement started. And to have this kind of historic moment for the party and for the state, I think this is an exciting time for us. And I think, obviously, all of us will find the ways that we can now contribute to the larger goal of making New York affordable, right? So I think the DA is going to continue to be a progressive DA in Brooklyn. I'll continue to be an ally in the state legislature, and someone who also, with co-equal powers, holds the governor and the second floor accountable. But at the same time, when there are moments to work together, I think we lean into those moments. And when there are differences, I think us as Democrats have to learn how to resolve those issues in a way that makes sense for the party and also for the state of New York.
And you see those relationships being mended or things changing when it comes to that dynamic there?
I think the healing process started on Friday. The Brooklyn delegation did endorse the governor. I think there was a bit of friction, obviously, in the 72-hour lead up to the convention. But ultimately, what happened was we realized that it was more important to have a steady hand at the wheel, leading our state forward at this moment of uncertainty from the federal government. And I think us as Democrats will find a way to make sure that this is a footnote in a larger story of what's going to be an overwhelming election, I think, in November for the governor.
Adrienne Adams as the pick here. And we know the well-documented history of Governor Hochul's lieutenant governors at this point. what makes you believe that she is the right pick and she will be the one to foster in a new era for the governor moving forward?
Look, one thing I know about Adrienne is she worked with a very diverse and led a very diverse city council of 51 members that have different political ideologies. And I think when you're someone who can work with 51 personalities, you could certainly work with one. I think Adrienne has shown the kind of municipal leadership that's needed at the time, particularly when you have so many hyper local issues popping up. I think she's a right pick. I think she's going to be someone who compliments the governor. She's hardworking, she's smart, she's articulate, and she can speak to mayors and local elected officials all across the state about how important the work that we're doing at the state level and how it impacts them. So I'm very excited for Adrienne and someone who I supported obviously in the mayor's election as well. So I've supported both Adrienne for speaker and for mayor, and I've supported the governor when she was lieutenant governor and governor. So this is I think a perfect moment to kind of see that I've always been right about who to support. And obviously as somebody who's raised by a mom, a strong woman, I know the importance of having strong women lead our party as well moving forward.
And just one more on this whole dynamic, since we're talking a little bit after the convention here about, and now since it's happened, we've seen Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado drop out.
Yeah.
What did you make of his decision making over the course of the last year?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know what made the decision for the lieutenant governor to enter the race for governor, but I do know that what made it clear for him that he should not be in the race moving forward is the fact that we need a unified party. And I think when you look at the convention and the folks who came out for the governor convention and even the delegation from the congressional folks like AOC and Mayor Mamdani, who could be seen as left of the governor, and folks who are more moderates in the party like member King Jeffries and others, I think it was pretty clear that whether you're on the far left of the party, the pragmatic brand of the party, or more centrist in the party, that we all kind of agree that the state of New York is moving forward and we have a governor who's been uncontroversial, someone who's been able to work with members both sides of the aisle, and someone who I think is going to lead our state into just brighter days in the months and years ahead.
It is interesting because he did mirror a lot of the things and ended up helping Zohran Mamdani win the election, right? And he was openly critical about the governor for some of those things.
Well, we talked about it earlier, right? The city and the state are very different.
Yeah.
We were talking about 5 counties in New York City, which I am so happy to be a part of the Brooklyn Democratic Party and so happy to be a member born and raised in Brooklyn and understand the needs of Brooklyn are different. But I also understand the needs of central New Yorkers are different. The needs of upstate New York is different, North Country. And I think you need leadership that is going to talk to the entire state, particularly at this moment where we are, as a state, facing headwinds. The cuts from federal government don't look at it and go, we're going to target New York City, right? Some of those cuts affect New York City more, but they also affect the jobs and the air quality and the tariffs for farmers upstate, right? And I think we need leadership that can talk to all of that and talk to our unique brand as New Yorkers and our fight as New Yorkers to make sure that we are a state and a union that continues to push this union forward.
Can you tell me what it's like to be vetted?
Vetting is interesting. Obviously, it's something that you can't talk about when you're being vetted.
Right.
Like a lot of people in the post reports kind of said, well, Brian wasn't being vetted. Well, the rule number 1 of rule of being vetting is don't talk about being vetted. And I think number 2, I think in many ways the vet is one, looking at compatibility in terms of the governor. And I think it's also just making sure that there's nothing that's going to embarrass the ticket. And I think obviously there was nothing in my background that would embarrass this ticket. But I think the governor made some calculations based on not who. When we started this vetting process or started the process of picking a ticket, she was running against 2 Republicans at the time, Stefanik and Blakeman. It's down to 1. And I think the calculus has changed in terms of how we look at the race and what's the best for the party and what's going to give us the best shot of not just winning, but also the best shot of having people at strategic places. And I think having members that are allies in the state legislature also makes a lot of sense in terms of some of the initiatives and goals that we have as a state.
Obviously, you're supportive of the governor, her choice. Were you disappointed? You know, you were, obviously you were a finalist for something that would have been a really big deal for you.
Yeah, as a human, obviously being disappointed is a normal part of life.
Yeah.
But I think it's not disappointment, it's how you handle disappointment. And I think how we've handled it is making sure that we lean into, like what we said in the beginning, is that we are not allies because we're on a list. We're not allies because of anything else other than the work we do. And I'm not going to stop doing that work. I have a fight for Brooklyn. I have a fire in my belly for Brooklyn. The governor's delivered for my district over and over again. Talk about $1.3 billion investment in our borough with our hospital, downstate hospital. We talk about the amount of bills we work together on, over 15 chapters of law. One decision from the governor is never going to shake my faith in her ability to be a leader that can help lead our state forward, and particularly my borough.
I wanted to also discuss immigration with you, and I know that obviously this has turned into a huge issue that the governor is addressing. And I think it was really interesting last year in her State of the State, she didn't mention immigration once, and she did in the budget. Obviously, at that point, we were looking at the influx of individuals that had come. For you, what have you heard from the governor, and do you think she's going far enough when it comes to this? Obviously, it's something that she's been pretty hands-on with now for the past, since she's begun this year of 26.
Well, let's talk about where we were as of this year. We've never seen an environment where immigrants are being shot dead in the streets, right? Innocent immigrants. And as a son of immigrants, my father was a cab driver. My mother was a home health aide worker. They got here in 1976 with $36 in their pocket and a dream that America was a place that was not only a manageable place, but a place of opportunities. We're seeing a very different tenor in the immigration process. There is no pathway to citizenship on the federal level. The last Republican that talked about a pathway to citizenship and talked about a city on a shining hill was Ronald Reagan. That was almost 50 years ago. That is troubling, and we need a governor who's going to stand up to the attacks coming out of the federal government. My staff and I have hunkered down on this issue. Obviously, we have people that are being impacted, whether it be small business down the street that seeing less customers because people are afraid to go into a shop and purchase things. We're seeing people who are silent in the streets because they're afraid their accent may give them away, or whether it be the young kids who are afraid to go to school because they may be separated from their parents and dropped off somewhere they weren't even born. We are seeing an outrageous overreach of the federal government in this issue, and I think some of the steps the governor has taken are obviously steps in the right direction. Our office has taken some positions as obviously a place that has 2 hospitals that serve the public, making sure that ICE cannot go there, right? Making sure we unmask federal agents. Police officers and law enforcement are respected professionals who show their face, they show their badge numbers, and they stand in their business. We want to make sure that every person that interacts with a person, I can't go to a town hall with a mask on and tell people my position without showing my face. We want to make sure that that happens in the state of New York. And I think the governor's taking a strong approach. And I think many of my colleagues, including our speaker, Carl Hastie, and Leader Stuart Cousins, have laid out a line in the sand saying New York is a place where the Statue of Liberty is, a place where we'll fight for our immigrants, and we have an attorney general who's going to take that to court if we have to.
I know you do have the legislation about identification, and if you want to talk about what that would do when it comes to a federal immigration officer.
Well, clearly, look, when a cop stops me, I have a right to ask that officer to show their badge and to reveal who they are. What we're seeing with these mass agents right now is they are rolling up on people, which is dangerous, by the way, from just a public safety perspective. Imagine somebody jumping out of the van with a mask on and grabbing you and telling you have to come with them. That sets up an environment where anyone can kidnap people, right? So what we're saying is that you have to identify who you are when making the arrest. You have to have a valid signed warrant by a judge. You just can't show up and roll up on people and tell them to follow you somewhere. That puts us all in danger. Anyone who cares about public safety cares about the integrity of law enforcement and their ability to do that in a thoughtful manner which identifies who they are and allows people to feel comfortable moving with that law enforcement agency.
Are you among the abolish ICE message?
Look, I think that as a federal government and state government, we have to make decisions about who we fund and what agencies are necessary. We have a border and control agency long before ICE. ICE is a relatively new agency.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much Republicans always talk about duplicative and big government. I'm wondering how much of ICE can be folded into border control. Certainly Homeland Security is also a new agency. So looking at, again, it's less about whether we abolish or not abolish. It's about what propensity funding and what autonomy these groups have. And as a government, we have an opportunity. I think the mayor, you mentioned Mayor Mamdani earlier, there's certainly new agencies he's created, the Division of Public Safety, that seems like a more thoughtful approach. Certainly ICE's approach and our communities have not been thoughtful. They should not continue to receive federal funding for the work they're doing, and they should be held accountable. And this president has an obligation and a right to make sure that all Americans, documented or undocumented, have due process. This is a stain on our democracy, and it's scared people away from our country.
The governor's recent proposals when it comes to elements of New York for All, do you think they go far enough? Because I know, I'll bring up this example, I think it was in Rochester last year, where members of their department were disciplined for, I think they called in immigration, or they played was backup, I don't know the exact, but they were disciplined for that. Should the state go that far with state resources in preventing that coordination?
I think, one, as state lawmakers, we have 2 responsibilities: introducing legislation and sign off on a governor's budget. I think members of this body have put forward thoughtful pieces of legislation, whether it be New York for All, whether it be the bills that I'm talking about. There are no bad bills out there, or enough bills out there for the governor to pick to get through both houses, present to her desk, and test her veto pen, right? And see if the governor will stand up to the ideas that we put on her desk. And I think that's the real test. The real test is we as a legislative body, we're a co-equal branch of government. We have an obligation to put together thoughtful legislation, get it through committees, get it to the floor, get it to the governor's desk, and see what the governor's done with it. I have 15 bills behind me that I put on the governor's desk. She's only vetoed 3 of my bills in the last 4 years I've been here. So I think the governor's shown time and time again her commitment to signing legislation that makes sense. It's our job to oppose legislation.
The counter to this conversation from those counties, municipalities that have the 287G programs, they're saying it's making their counties safer. Coordinating with immigration enforcement is helping just keep the dynamic cooler and not as chaotic as they give Minnesota as an example. How do you respond to that argument from that side of the aisle?
Look, I look at it like this. I don't think what you're seeing where people are fearful to leave their homes is ever a good approach. People are literally afraid to go outside. They're afraid to travel. They're afraid to come to America. There have been a number of tickets of people saying they're not coming to America because they don't want to be deported and sent somewhere else. That is not good for our economy. And the other side, my good friends, the Republican side, have always talked about the economy being their bread and butter issue. This is not good for our economy, and it's not good for public safety.
Finally here, as we wrap up, I did want to ask you, because I know 988 has been something that you've been focused on, and I think that's a broader conversation over the last few years. I've heard stories from people that say they've called and have been put on hold, which in that delicate of a time is an issue. Have we made strides there, and where do you think we need to move forward when it comes to 988 and being that resource that it's made out to be?
Well, look, when 301 first emerged under Mayor Michael Bloomberg,
Yeah.
it was a revolutionary program, and it took a while for that program to work out its kinks and to actually deliver on the services New Yorkers need. I think 988 is going to be a great program once fully funded. The challenge we have is funding and making sure we have a dedicated line item for that funding. Obviously, anyone who's in a mental health crisis needs a mental health response. We see a number of people, particularly our in-house New Yorkers, who have mental health challenges, right? And they are more likely to be victims of a crime if not supported and helped. So we're seeking, obviously, just to get some more funding in the budget to make sure we can baseline it so it has the same level of service that 301 or 911 has, that someone answers, it's 24-hour staffed, and we get the right person at that site to help. It puts both our officers, our men and women, protected, and also protects the most vulnerable population, those who are suffering from mental health.
And just to be clear, you want to make sure that this program is even more robust right now, because right now, as we've heard stories, that it has been very effective and impactful for a lot of people.
It's impactful and effective when it works, right? And we know what makes things work, particularly with a $260 billion budget, is an allocation of resources that would say that this is a problem that the state is serious about. We're serious about confronting, and I think that obviously providing more resources, particularly the levels that we fund 301 and 911, is appropriate for a mental health response that would also allow us to segment the deployment of our officers to make sure we're not putting them in harm's way and we're not putting the people who are receiving those calls in harm's way.
Brian Cunningham, thanks for the time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.